Spain did not collapse because it was poor. It collapsed because it confused wealth with strength. This story opens at dawn on the docks of Seville, where the river carries ships heavy with silver from across the ocean. Hulls groan as they settle into port. Bells ring. Crowds gather. The air is thick with awe and certainty. On paper, this is what power looks like. Vaults are full. Soldiers are paid. Kings rule with confidence. The empire appears blessed by fate. Yet beneath the spectacle lies a dangerous substitution. Money begins to replace judgment. Wealth stands in for discipline. Gold starts to speak louder than strategy. Think about that. When abundance arrives without effort, what happens to restraint? When success feels automatic, who still plans for failure? From the outside, Spain's rise looks like destiny. Treasure flows in volumes never seen before. Oceans are crossed and controlled. Flags spread across continents. The empire's accounts swell with numbers that promise security and dominance. But this story is not about how Spain became rich. It is about how that richness reshaped the empire's mind. Wealth did not simply fund power. It redefined it. Decisions shortened. Patience thinned. Risk felt smaller because tomorrow's silver always seemed guaranteed. The future became something to borrow from, not something to build toward. In that moment, Spain crossed a line most empires never see. It stopped asking how power is created and focused only on how it is spent. The danger was not greed alone. It was substitution. Gold arrived faster than institutions could mature. Silver filled vaults faster than skills could develop. Spain no longer needed to cultivate productivity at home when extraction abroad delivered instant results. Why refine systems when ships did the work? Why invest in people when treasure paid for outcomes? These questions did not sound reckless at first. They sounded practical. They sounded efficient. And that is how the trap closed quietly. Power became something you could purchase instead of something you had to maintain. Strength became a balance sheet, not a capability. Imagine the royal chambers where decisions are made. Candlelight reflects off polished surfaces. Advisors speak of wars won and lands claimed. Ledgers lie open, thick with figures that seem to justify every choice. When money appears endless, discipline feels optional. Oversight feels slow. Reform feels unnecessary. The empire begins to mistake income for resilience. That mistake is subtle. It does not announce itself with crisis. It embeds itself in habits. Spain learns that it can solve problems with payments rather than preparation. Armies can be funded without reform. Wars can be extended without strategy. Short-term fixes crowd out long-term thinking. This is where the central contradiction forms. Spain is growing richer, yet its foundations are not deepening. The empire expands, but its internal strength remains thin. Wealth arrives, but capability does not keep pace. Think about that imbalance. It is not visible from afar. From the outside, Spain looks invincible. Its fleets dominate sea lanes. Its influence shapes Europe. Its monarchs command fear and respect. But power that depends on continuous inflow is not power. It is dependence disguised as dominance. The docks of Seville become more than a port. They become a psychological anchor. Each arriving ship reinforces a belief that extraction is strength. Each successful voyage confirms the idea that effort elsewhere is unnecessary. The empire begins to live from shipment to shipment. Planning bends around arrivals. Expectations rise. Spending follows anticipation, not reality. The present consumes the future before it arrives. This is how wealth starts to mortgage time itself. Spain spends tomorrow's silver today because tomorrow feels guaranteed. This chapter is not about moral failure. It is about structural temptation. Any system flooded with easy wealth faces the same risk. When resources fall from the sky, discipline feels inefficient. Prudence looks timid. Restraint feels like missed opportunity. Spain's leaders did not wake up intending to hollow out their empire. They responded rationally to the incentives in front of them. Silver rewarded speed, not patience. Expansion rewarded conquest, not consolidation. Consumption felt safer than reform. Over time, these choices rewired how power was understood. The stakes of this transformation were enormous. Spain was not managing a small state. It was managing a global system. Trade routes crossed oceans. Wars spanned continents. Decisions made in candlelit rooms echoed across millions of lives. When wealth replaced judgment at that scale, the consequences were not immediate. They were delayed, amplified, and systemic. The empire became vulnerable not to enemies alone, but to its own assumptions. Think about the difference between money and strength. Money can hire soldiers. Strength trains them. Money can buy ships. Strength builds shipyards. Money can silence problems. Strength solves them. Spain chose the first option repeatedly because it worked, until it didn't. The empire's obsession with wealth made efficient in the short term and fragile in the long term, and fragility at scale is dangerous. There's a moment in every empire when success becomes its own argument. Spain reached that moment early. Each victory justified the next gamble. Each influx of silver encouraged greater commitments. Wars expanded because they could be financed. Alliances hardened because payments replaced compromise. The empire began to live beyond its productive capacity, trusting that extraction would always cover the gap. This is how wealth turns into leverage against the future. The more Spain relied on silver, the less flexible it became. When systems depend on a single source, resilience disappears quietly. This chapter asks a simple but unsettling question. Can an empire survive when its wealth grows faster than its capacity to use it wisely? Spain's story suggests the answer is no, because wisdom requires limits, and limits are hard to respect when abundance feels permanent. Spain did not fail because it lacked resources. It failed because resources removed the pressure to evolve. The empire mistook flow for foundation, income for strength, and arrival for achievement. As the sun rises higher over Seville, the crowds disperse. The silver is counted, stamped, and moved into vaults. On the surface, nothing is wrong. The system is working exactly as designed. But beneath the ritual lies a fragile dependency. Strength is no longer rooted in production, innovation, or discipline. It is rooted in expectation. The hope that ships will keep arriving. The belief that wealth will continue to substitute for structure. This is the quiet beginning of decline. Not with collapse, but with confidence. And that confidence will shape every chapter that follows. To the outside world, Spain looked unstoppable. It ruled oceans that others barely understood. Its flags appeared in ports thousands of miles apart. Its fleets moved with a confidence that suggested permanence. From Europe to the Americas, Spain sat at the center of a global system that seemed to feed itself. Silver poured in from overseas territories in staggering volumes, filling royal coffers and underwriting ambition. Palaces rose. Armies marched. Wars were financed without hesitation. To rivals and subjects alike, Spain did not look like a state managing power. It looked like power itself. Imagine the imperial court at its height. Vast halls glow under candlelight. Walls are lined with symbols of conquest and faith. Advisors speak in measured tones about destiny and order. Ledgers are opened, and the numbers appear reassuring. Revenues flow not from taxes squeezed out of restless populations, but from distant lands that seem endlessly generous. This changes the atmosphere of decision-making. Urgency fades. Hard trade-offs soften. When money arrives from beyond the horizon, the cost of mistakes feel distant. The empire does not feel constrained by limits. It feels insulated from them. Spain's position allowed it to bypass pressures that shaped other European states. While rivals struggled to fund wars through taxation, Spain paid with silver. While others experimented with banking systems and credit markets, Spain relied on shipments. While competitors invested in manufacturing and domestic trade, Spain imported what it needed. This was not ignorance. It was choice. Why invest years building industries when treasure ships delivered immediate returns? Why cultivate a merchant class when foreign goods could be purchased cheaply and quickly? The illusion was convincing. Efficiency seemed to favor extraction over production. For a time, this approach produced results. Spain's armies remained formidable. Its fleets controlled key sea lanes. Its influence shaped diplomacy across Europe. The empire could intervene far from home, sustaining long conflicts that would have bankrupted lesser states. Easy wealth gave Spain reach. It gave Spain presence. And presence was mistaken for strength. Think about that. Power that appears everywhere begins to feel infinite, even when it rests on a narrow base. The illusion deepened because it was reinforced by success. Each completed voyage validated the system. Each influx of silver silenced critics. Doubt struggled to survive in an environment where outcomes kept confirming assumptions. Spain did not experience scarcity in the way others did. Scarcity teaches discipline. Scarcity forces innovation. Spain experienced abundance. Abundance rewards continuation. The empire learned to repeat what worked, not to question it. And repetition hardened into habit. From the outside, Spain's economy looked rich. From the inside, it was hollowing. Domestic production lagged behind consumption. Workshops closed as imported goods flooded markets. Skilled labor declined because demand shifted outward. It was easier to buy than to build. Over time, this reshaped society itself. Wealth concentrated around access to silver, not around creation of value. Incentives tilted toward court favor and extraction rather than enterprise. The empire became excellent at moving money and less capable of making things. Yet these weaknesses were masked by scale. As long as silver kept flowing, inefficiency remained invisible. Inflation rose, but it was tolerated. Debt accumulated, but it was manageable. Problems were postponed, not solved, and postponement felt like control. Spain could afford to delay reforms because immediate consequences were rare. That is how illusions survive. They are protected by buffers. Silver was Spain's buffer. It absorbed shocks that would have exposed flaws elsewhere. Imagine rival states watching Spain with a mix of fear and envy. They saw an empire that did not seem bound by the same rules. Spain could lose ships and still recover. It could fight multiple wars at once. It could pay soldiers even when campaigns stalled. This perception mattered. Fear reinforced Spain's dominance. Diplomacy bent around its assumed strength. The empire's reputation became a force multiplier, and reputation fed the illusion further. When everyone believes you are strong, it becomes easy to act as if you are. But reputation is not resilience. It does not repair systems. It does not train workers. It does not adapt structures. Spain's power relied increasingly on external flows and external confidence. Internally, the foundations were not keeping pace with the empire's ambitions. The state expanded faster than its administrative capacity. Spending outpaced planning. Commitments multiplied. Easy money made expansion feel painless. But expansion without consolidation is a slow drain. Spain's leaders were not blind. They understood that wealth could be wasted. They understood that corruption existed. But the urgency to correct it was dulled by abundance. When problems arise in a system flooded with money, the instinct is to spend more. More oversight costs money. More reform costs money. But silver made spending feel cheap. And so, instead of reshaping institutions, Spain financed around them. It patched weaknesses with payments. That approach works until the bill comes due. The illusion of strength also shaped Spain's view of time. The future was treated as predictable because the past had been generous. Patterns of arrival created expectations of continuity. This bred confidence, but also rigidity. When systems assume stability, they struggle with disruption. Spain's empire was optimized for steady inflows, not for shocks. Any interruption, whether from piracy, war, or logistics, created outsized stress. The empire's apparent dominance hid a growing sensitivity to disturbance. Think about the difference between flexibility and size. Spain had size. It had reach. But flexibility requires diversity of strength. It requires multiple sources of resilience. Spain narrowed its base as it expanded its surface. The empire's economy leaned heavily on silver. Its military leaned heavily on payment rather than reform. Its politics leaned heavily on prestige rather than accountability. These choices were not immediately fatal. They were quietly cumulative. At the height of its power, Spain did not look fragile. It looked complete. That is why the danger was greatest then. Empires rarely collapse when they feel threatened. They collapse when they feel secure. Security breeds complacency. Complacency delays adaptation. Spain's illusion of strength insulated it from feedback. Warning signs were absorbed by wealth and dismissed as temporary. The empire mistook endurance for invulnerability. Every arriving ship reinforced a narrative. Every paid army confirmed a model. Every imported good made domestic production feel unnecessary. This was the high point of the illusion. Spain appeared rich, powerful, and untouchable. But appearance is not capacity. And capacity is what sustains power when conditions change. Spain's system was not designed for change. It was designed for continuation. This chapter is about that dangerous moment when success becomes a trap. Spain's wealth allowed it to skip steps that others were forced to take. It bought time, comfort, and reach, but it also removed pressure to build foundations. The empire did not fall because it lacked resources. It fell because resources hid the cost of its choices. And those costs were accumulating quietly, waiting for the moment when silver could no longer absorb them. By the time the illusion began to crack, it was deeply embedded. Spain had structured its power around wealth rather than strength. Undoing that would have required restraint, reform, and patience. Those qualities are hard to summon at the height of dominance. And so the empire continued forward, confident in its model, unaware that the very success it celebrated was eroding the ground beneath it. The cracks did not arrive as disasters. They arrived as routines. Spain spent wealth as it appeared, then learned to spend it before it arrived at all. Silver was no longer just income. It became collateral. Future shipments were pledged to cover present costs. Credit expanded quietly, wrapped in confidence and expectation. Inflation crept through markets, lifting prices and dulling purchasing power. Everyday goods became more expensive, not because they were scarce, but because money was everywhere. Think about that. When currency multiplies faster than value, prices rise even in times of apparent prosperity. This was the hidden mechanism at the heart of Spain's decline. Wealth without production, money without leverage. The empire extracted vast resources, but it did not convert them into a self-sustaining economy. Silver flowed in, then flowed straight back out to pay for foreign goods, foreign services, and foreign debt. Spain became rich in appearance and poor in structure. Its economy leaned outward instead of inward. Instead of building workshops, it imported tools. Instead of training artisans, it bought finished products. Instead of strengthening domestic trade, it financed consumption. Imagine the streets of Spanish cities as this process unfolds. Shops filled with imported goods. Local craftsmen struggle to compete with cheaper, mass-produced items from abroad. Skills fade as demand disappears. Young workers find fewer opportunities to learn trades. Wealth concentrates around access to silver rather than around creation of value. The economy begins to hollow from the inside. This is not collapse. It is erosion, slow, quiet, and easy to ignore when silver still arrives. Debt grows in the background. It is justified as temporary, manageable, even clever. Why wait for silver to arrive when future shipments are certain? Borrow now, pay later. This logic works as long as the future behaves exactly like the past. But the future rarely does. Spain's commitments multiplied faster than its flexibility. Wars were financed on credit. Armies were paid with borrowed money. Interest became a permanent expense. Over time, servicing debt consumed more resources than innovation ever received. Inflation added another layer of strain. As silver flooded the economy, its value declined. Prices rose. Wages lagged. Those without access to wealth felt the pressure first. Social tension increased quietly. The state responded not with reform, but with more spending, more silver, more borrowing. This created a feedback loop. Money solved symptoms while deepening causes. Problems were treated as funding gaps rather than structural weaknesses. Think about how this shapes behavior. When money is a solution to every problem, judgment weakens. Efficiency matters less than access. Oversight feels optional. Corruption spreads because consequences are delayed. Spain's administrative system struggled to keep pace with the scale of wealth moving through them. Funds leaked. Projects bloated. Accountability thinned. None of this felt urgent because silver masked the damage. The system was not failing dramatically. It was decaying quietly. Wars grew more expensive, not more effective. Spain could afford large armies, but paying soldiers is not the same as organizing them well. Command structures lagged. Logistics suffered. Strategy became reactive. Money kept campaigns going long after they should have ended. Losses were absorbed financially rather than addressed operationally. This prolonged conflict without improving outcomes. The empire fought longer, not smarter. As rivals faced scarcity, they adapted. They experimented with finance. They built industries. They developed trade networks that created recurring value. Spain watched this happen and doubled down on silver. Why change a system that still pays? That question delayed reform at the exact moment it was needed most. The empire's leaders saw short-term stability and mistook it for long-term security. Imagine a ledger where numbers grow larger each year, yet margins shrink. Revenue increases, but costs rise faster. Interest eats into income. Obligations stack up. The empire becomes rich yet perpetually strained. This is the paradox at the center of Spain's story. It possessed immense wealth, but it was always short of cash. Payments were due before shipments arrived. Creditors waited. Anxiety replaced confidence behind closed doors. This dependency created vulnerability. Any disruption in silver flows triggered panic. Piracy, storms, war, or administrative delays could throw finances into chaos. The empire had no buffer beyond the very thing it depended on. When shipments slowed, the system seized. Payments stalled. Confidence wavered. Spain's power was not just concentrated. It was brittle. The turning point did not arrive with a single event. There was no decisive moment where leaders chose decline. It arrived when debt replaced discipline as a foundation of power. When borrowing became routine, reform became optional. When future wealth was pledged repeatedly, the future itself was constrained. Spain was no longer steering its empire. It was managing obligations. Think about how difficult it is to reverse such a system. Reform requires restraint. Restraint feels impossible when commitments are fixed and expectations are high. Cutting spending risks unrest. Reducing wars risks prestige. Limiting imports disrupts consumption. Every corrective action carries immediate pain. Borrowing delays that pain. So borrowing continues. This is how empires trap themselves. As silver lost its shock value, it stopped feeling like abundance and started feeling like maintenance. It no longer transformed the system. It barely sustained it. The empire required constant inflow just to function. Growth was no longer optional. It was mandatory. And mandatory growth is dangerous because it eliminates flexibility. Behind the scenes, confidence eroded. Creditors demanded higher interest. Trust weakened. Spain's reputation shifted subtly. It was still powerful, but increasingly risky. That shift mattered. Power depends on perception as much as force. When confidence fades, leverage disappears. Spain found itself paying more to borrow the same amount. Debt tightened its grip. This chapter is where illusion turns into inevitability. Spain's wealth could no longer hide its weaknesses. The economic mechanism that once fueled expansion now amplified fragility. Extraction crowded out production. Borrowing crowded out reform. Spending crowded out strategy. None of this happened overnight. It unfolded through habits that felt reasonable at the time. Think about the lesson embedded here. Wealth is not strength unless it is converted into systems that endure. Money that circulates without building capacity creates dependence. Spain's economy became a machine that required constant input to avoid breakdown. When that input faltered, even briefly, stress rippled everywhere. By the time leaders recognized the depth of the problem, options were limited. The empire was locked into commitments shaped by decades of abundance. Changing course required sacrifice on a scale that threatened stability. So the system continued forward, managing decline rather than preventing it. The silver kept coming, but it no longer promised a future. It merely postponed the reckoning. This is the quiet heart of Spain's downfall. Not conquest, not invasion, not a single defeat, but an economic structure that traded resilience for convenience, wealth without production, power without leverage, debt without discipline. The empire was still standing, still fighting, still spending, but it was no longer in control of its trajectory. It was borrowing time from a future that could no longer pay it back. When collapse finally came, it did not announce itself with a single disaster. It arrived as exhaustion. Spain's system, stretched for generations, simply lost the ability to recover. Wars continued, but their outcomes no longer justified their cost. Revenue shrank in real terms, even when silver still arrived. Creditors grew impatient. Interest payments consumed growing portions of income. What once felt like abundance now felt like suffocation. Imagine officials gathered around ledgers that no longer reassured, arguing over how to divide funds that were already spoken for. Obligations stayed fixed. Flexibility vanished. Silver no longer transformed Spain's position. It merely kept machinery running. Shipyards stood quieter. Maintenance replaced expansion. Armies were paid, but morale thinned, logistics frayed. The empire still looked imposing on maps, but maps do not measure capacity. Behind the lines, strain was everywhere. Each year required more effort to sustain less influence. That is how decline feels from the inside. Not dramatic, but draining. The global balance shifted quietly. Rivals did not need to defeat Spain outright. They outlasted it. States that had invested in production, finance, and trade networks adapted faster to change. They absorbed shocks. They generated value internally. Spain, by contrast, depended on external flows that grew less reliable over time. When silver shipments slowed, even briefly, the consequences were immediate. Payments stalled. Confidence cracked. Power that depends on uninterrupted inflow has no margin for error. Imagine empty docks compared to their former spectacle. Fewer ships, longer waits, crowds thinner, more anxious. Each delay triggered fear because the system had no alternative source of strength. The empire had spent centuries narrowing its base. When that base faltered, everything above it wobbled. This is the cost of substituting wealth for structure. The moment wealth weakens, there is nothing underneath to catch the fall. Spain's dominance faded unevenly. Some territories slipped away through war, others through neglect. Trade routes shifted as competitors offered more reliable systems. Influence declined not because Spain stopped trying, but because try became too expensive. Every action required borrowing. Every decision deepened dependence. Power turned reactive. Strategy narrowed to survival. The aftermath was not a single collapse, but long unwinding. Prestige lingered even as capacity drained. Rituals continued. Titles remained, but substance eroded. Spain had sold too much of its future to preserve its past. The empire that once dictated terms now negotiated constraints. Its choices were shaped by creditors as much as by rivals. That is the final stage of economic decline, when leverage moves outward. Think about the irony. Spain possessed resources other states could only dream of, yet those resources became a substitute for development rather than a foundation for it. Wealth delayed reform instead of enabling it. Extraction crowded out production. Consumption crowded out resilience. By the time silver lost its central role in global power, Spain had not built alternatives at scale. It had optimized for a world that no longer existed. This story does not belong only to early modern Europe. Its logic repeats across time. Any state that mistakes income for capability walks the same path. Resources can amplify power, but they cannot replace structure. Money can buy time, but it cannot buy judgment. When systems rely on constant inflow, they trade resilience for convenience. And convenience always expires. Spain's fatal obsession was not gold itself. It was a belief that wealth could replace strength. That belief reshaped incentives, habits, and institutions over generations. It made short-term success feel permanent and long-term planning feel unnecessary. Empires rarely collapse from poverty. They collapse from imbalance, from growth that outpaces foundation, from confidence that outlives capacity. The warning is simple and uncomfortable. Power is not what you can spend. It is what you can sustain. When wealth grows faster than wisdom, decline begins quietly. Spain learned that lesson the hard way, over centuries, with consequences that reshaped the world. And that lesson still matters, because the temptation has never disappeared. If this story changed how you see power, history, and wealth, subscribe for more cinematic documentaries like this. And if you think others should hear this warning too, share it.